Let's reconnect.
Great. Thanks so much, Hugo. I'm also so extremely excited to be here. I won't lie, during the pandemic, every so often I would worry, oh, there might not be any more recon. So I'm excited that we're finally having one and we can reconnect and see each other again. So just wanted to check if my slides are up. So today I'm going to talk about zero-click exploits in Zoom. The alternate title of this presentation is How to Reverse Engineer a Huge Pile of Code. Because, well, I found a lot of interesting bugs in Zoom. I think the more interesting part was the process. It was one of the more difficult reverse engineering challenges I've dealt with in a while. So, I'm Natalie Silvanovich, and I'm a member of Project Zero at Google. And I have to admit that for a while, I didn't look at Zoom, even though it was really popular, just because I didn't think it was the type of thing that attackers would use 0 days in, because I didn't know it had a remote attack surface. But it turned out I was wrong. To step back a bit, Zoom is a video conferencing meeting solution. I feel like a lot of people, if they're like me, they often use Zoom in the browser because it's the sort of thing where you can click on a link and join a call. But there's actually a lot more to Zoom. There's native clients for all sorts of platforms, including Linux, Windows, iOS, Android, and more. So what ended up getting me started on this research, after thinking there was no fully remote attack surface, was this Pwn2Own entry in 2021. And Dan Cooper and This Alkabade won with a fully remote bug in Zoom. Also around the same time, there was this news article that people were selling fully remote Zoom 0 days for about $500,000. So this sent me searching for this attack surface that might have this type of bug. So I started off by installing Zoom and playing with it a bit. Funnily enough, this is the way I start a lot of my bug finding projects. Even if I'm looking at something like a phone, sorry, I think we've lost the slides again here. There we go. So, something I find useful, even if I'm looking at a phone, is to use it for a week or use an app for a week and just kind of see what the range of features are and manipulate them a bit. And Zoom also had a lot of documentation because it's used a lot in corporate environments, so there were lots of white papers explaining how stuff worked. And it had a lot of features I didn't expect. The big one is that it's actually kind of a messaging client, which is great because I love messaging clients. And you can add what I called Zoom contacts, and then these people can message you in the Zoom client. And the really interesting thing is that they can call you like a phone call on your mobile device. So if someone's your contact, you can just press a button and their phone will ring, and if they accept, it'll start a Zoom call. The other thing that's interesting is that in a corporate environment, everyone in your company is automatically your Zoom contact, so you can just do this. So I also discovered there are lots and lots of ways to start meetings that aren't necessarily in the browser. Yeah, there's the links, there's the clients, you can even dial in. There's also a webinar feature, so there's a special way you can have a call if you just want to talk and have a really large number of people listen. And finally, there is these on-premises servers. So if you work in a regulated environment and you want to have all the audio and video going through Zoom be on your premises, you can set up your own server. And more on that later. So to start off, to figure out the attack surface, I looked at past bugs. And I was really intrigued by this pwn-to-own bug, but unfortunately the write-up didn't come out until I was well through the research. But even the fact that it just existed gave me ideas. It turns out, in hindsight, it was a memory corruption bug in crypto key exchange. So when you do the thing where you call your Zoom contact and their phone rings, it'll exchange crypto keys for the Zoom call, and then there was an overflow in that. So this meant, it was fully remote, but not fully remote, in that the person did have to be your contact. You couldn't do this to any user on Zoom. But I looked back at other bugs as well. There were a few reported by Talos, and the most interesting one was a directory traversal bug. So there is this special message format, which is actually kind of cool. It was the code plugin. So you could put this plugin in your messaging client and then, send code with like perfect formatting to another person, and they don't have to have the client installed. And basically this bug was directory traversal and how that worked. And there were a few others, but this seemed to be pretty consistent in all the ones that I saw that allowed code execution, which was they were mostly directory traversal or other logic bugs. And I did spend a bit of time looking at this. The reason that this didn't appeal to me, though, was getting these to work on multiple platforms is hard. I didn't think that this would, for example, be a great way to get an exploit to work on Android. So I was hoping to find some more robust bugs. So, yeah, attacker scenarios I considered. One was obviously someone calls their contact. Also, even though it isn't fully remote, I did think a bit about the situation where either someone is enticed to join a malicious meeting, or, these days there's, orchestra performances on Zoom and, court hearings on Zoom. So maybe someone logs in to attack someone specific. They're like, I got to get that trombone player. So they log into the concert and they can do that. I have server ? Because I didn't know what the server could do at this point. And finally, I want to mention the Zoom SDK. This isn't really an attack surface I considered, but it is something that is important for analysis, which is that you can use the Zoom SDK on a variety of platforms and kind of write your own Zoom. And the idea here is, like, let's say you have a shopping app that allows customer support. You can, like, integrate Zoom, so someone could, like, press the talk to a customer support representative button, and it will, like, set up that call. And this meant that there were these libraries available that I could at least use to manipulate Zoom features in a way I might not be able to otherwise. So I started off by loading Zoom into IDA, and I mostly looked at the Linux client because that's where I do most of my reverse engineering, and just eek. It was huge. It is statically linked, so every Zoom library is in one big binary. There were very few log entries. What I did notice is that other platforms did split out the library, in particular on Android they did. So I used this to identify some functions, the different splits, because obviously to call a library you have to export the function name. And honestly, I was grasping at straws, so a few more function names were good. Different compilers have different symbols. For example, Linux binaries will typically have the class name in the vtable, which helps. I didn't know this at the time, but in the pwn to own entry, they also found out that the SDK binaries have more logging in them. So if you want to find, they'll, for example, be the Windows version of the binary, and then if you get the same one from this SDK, it'll have extra logs. So I started off by looking at XMPP. There's a lot of lore about how Zoom uses XMPP, and also a fair bit of actual documentation. So I looked for the library in hopes of basically hooking it and figuring out what to do with, or what it does with XMPP. I discovered it uses a library called Glux. And I looked at the website, and of course the first thing I notice is rock solid. Like, you know, as soon as you see this, my spidey signal turns on. So I immediately fuzzed it, and what? This is the first library that has said it's rock solid that has actually turned out to be rock solid. I couldn't find any bugs, and I looked at the history, and there's actually been very few bugs in it. So I guess that was a failed avenue. But at least I knew that, like, it did use XMPP, though the hooking on this turned out to be kind of inconvenient. So I looked at other ways to try and see the Zoom's traffic. Zoom obviously talks to a number of servers, and then some of these servers forward Zoom traffic to other devices. So I was hoping to, see all of this and see what the different systems were. Some people like to use Wireshark to do this and add a self-signed cert. You actually can do this with Zoom. It will warn you about the cert, but once you accept, it'll let you use it. But it's a bit of a pain in that, once you decide you want to start changing the packets, that's a lot more work. So I ended up using IDA, or I mean Frida. I tried to find every version of SSL write, and there were actually quite a few in this huge binary, because there were tons of libraries in there. Some of them I'm not sure how they used, things like curl. So I found all of them either based on logging, and then if logs were stripped, OpenSSL will have cipher names that are strings, so you can trace them up and then find the function. And eventually, I hooked the right one. Frida, if you don't know, is my favorite tool that I will go on and on about how much I love. It's basically a tool where you can write a Python script that has these JavaScript interceptors that you can put into your program, and they'll run. So in this case, this one will attach to SSL write, though in this case, because there's no symbols, I had to find the actual address and put it in there. And then it'll do stuff like print out the traffic. So then I could see the outgoing packets. There was the XMPP and a lot of other stuff. So I tried to find bugs in XMPP, but I failed. I was hoping there would be not bugs in the processing, but bugs in how they used, the username in there, how they use the keys, that sort of thing. It ended up being complicated. So I asked someone on my team, Ned Williamson, if he could find symbols for Zoom. And he has this talent for it. He's also found symbols for Viber and WhatsApp. And he went on the Wayback Machine, and lo and behold, 5 years ago, they released a version of the SDK with symbols. So I keep learning this, that if you're reverse engineering something, maybe looking for the binary with symbols is like the first thing you should do. But, these were not perfect. 5 years old, not everything was there, but it was at least enough to get like an overview of the system. There was also no core binary. Because this is an SDK, they would have things like starting a call or sending a message, but they didn't have the actual driver in Zoom that actually does all this stuff. So that was missing. But yeah, I continued looking at XMPP, and I still didn't find any bugs in this area. And then I found out later that the pwn-to-own entry had indeed used a bug in this area. So they do exist, I guess. I just didn't find them. So I think we got slide issue. There we go. So at this point, I became curious about how the audio and video was transmitted. And this isn't a fully zero-click exploit, but I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to figure it out, especially since this is an area that I've done a fair amount of research into before. Almost all video conferencing systems use a protocol called RTP, real-time transport protocol, to send their audio and video, and I've found tons of vulnerabilities in this type of processing. So I went to figure out how it worked. The RTP entry point was challenging to locate. What's really common in these types of systems is that they'll output a log entry where if SDP decryption or encryption fails, but they didn't seem to have one of these in Zoom, so I ended up just searching for like the names of certain features in RTP. The winner was extensions, and that's a feature of RTP that has a lot of problems. So I found where they were processed, and it seemed like what they were doing was right compared to the standard. So I set up some fuzzing. Basically, I loaded this Zoom binary as a shared library and called into the RTP entry point, and that was kind of my fuzzing harness. I was hoping to do some fuzzing directly on the video codecs, but I never was able to work this out, so I'm just going to say that's an area for future work. They use a custom codec called libzealot, and unfortunately, the way the library for it works is it only has one export that will give you an object, and then all the functions that actually make the codec work are just pointers, and you have to call in at that offset. So that was, I thought just too time consuming, so I moved on and just did the RTP fuzzing. I used a tool called DRASAN, which was, sorry, slides again here. Yeah, which was written by Mateusz Jurczyk on my team. It is a super cool tool that I couldn't believe I hadn't used before. It allows you to add coverage to basically any Linux binary, even if you don't compile it. So it's something you put on the command line, and then your fuzzing has coverage. So I ran this fuzzing, and it found a bug in RTP, but then I discovered that you couldn't send RTP peer-to-peer. If I sent this malformed packet, it would not come through on the other side. So I decided it was time to set up my own server. So I got this on-premises server. It was a bit expensive. I think it was like $200 a month, but I mean, you can't put a price on cool bugs. And it was hard to set up. I ended up contacting the Zoom security team to get it working, and they were super helpful. And I ended up with my very own Zoom server. This on-premises server has a couple of components. So when a client uses it, it still uses the Zoom public cloud to set up a call, but then it has these sort of two servers that are used to process audio and video. There's the ZC, which is the Zoom controller, which is kind of boring, but then there's the MMR, and I eventually figured out that stands for multimedia router, and this was the main thing that handled the RTP. So I discovered that this server decodes and re-encodes the audio and video stuff. And in hindsight, that doesn't surprise me, because now that I think of it, it's pretty common for systems like Zoom to have a video stream that they send to tons and tons of people. So of course, it's better instead of having one stream they just have to duplicate if they can, for example, make it smaller for a phone screen and do things like that. So if Zoom doesn't use end-to-end encryption, if this hasn't been enabled, then it will actually take this content out of the RTP packet and repackage it. So with this server, though, once you own the server, I can send whatever RTP to whoever I want. So I tried this, and my bug didn't work. And it turned out I was wrong about the entry point. There was one more layer up that processed RTP and had all the checks in it. So that was kind of a failed avenue. But now I had a cool server, so I wanted to see what I could do with that. I decided to fuzz the MMR processing or the RTP processing on the server. Because if you have Zoom sending RTP and then the server is taking apart the packets and repackaging them, if there was a bug there, right, that could be a problem, because you could hit this just by starting a Zoom call, so it wouldn't require any interaction from the user. So I decided to fuzz this. This was interesting. So I start playing with this MMR, and it does not have AXLR enabled. The year is currently, or it was 2020 at the time. It had been a long time since I'd seen a binary like that. But it was indeed there, and it was just for the MMR binary. The libraries like libc were still randomized, but other than security, my immediate problem was this made fuzzing hard because I can't load this into memory space because it's not relocatable. So what I ended up doing was my fuzzer, I would run the MMR binary, and this binary would eventually call fopen, as binaries tend to do when they start up. So I used LD preload to load a library I wrote that redefined fopen, and then the fopen would call back into the MMR to call the function I wanted to fuzz. I think that the way I put this in my blog post is this approach had some downsides. So it would call fuzzopen and then call into my fuzzing thing, just if you want a visualization here. But yeah, this was kind of the best way I could come up with to fuzz a non-relocatable binary. But unfortunately, oh yeah, the other thing is, of course, if you do this on the first FOPIN, like none of the initialization is done in your binary, so I had to find all the functions that did that and then call them. But I had something that like kind of worked. But after this, there were no results, which made me rather sad. But moving on. So I kind of, at this point, had exhausted two types of packets. The XMPP, I'd found no bugs. The RTP, nothing. So I started figuring out, what is all this other stuff? And it turned out there was kind of a custom message packet format in a library called libssb_sdk.so. And what's nice about this one is the symbols for it were in the SDK. So, like from here on in, when I'm talking about function names, these are the real function names. So this class had tons of things with functions called load from and save to, which makes me think that they extended a class or an interface. Unfortunately, the symbols for that had been stripped, that allows serialization. And using Frida, I found one of these functions in a binary I could execute and confirmed that if I sent one of these from one side, it would be deserialized with the serializer on the other side. So I reviewed this entire interface function by function. So this is the first bug I found. So this processes a packet type, and what it does is it reads a string length out of a packet, and then it allocates a buffer of that size. And then it calls this function. And then it reads another length out of the buffer, and then it copies that size into the buffer. So this is like a perfect heap overflow bug. You can decide how big the thing that gets overflowed is. You can decide how much it gets overflowed, and you can decide what gets overflowed. So everything about this bug is under your control. So I carried on with this. I tested the bug on the MMR server, and I couldn't hit the code. It was behind a flag, and I traced the flag. And it turned out it was for webinar features. So this type of packet was only processed on the server during a webinar. So for $81.73 a month, I enabled this feature, and then suddenly my bug worked. And because Public Zoom also uses MMR servers, I was worried that this might work on a public server, but I wasn't willing to try a bug of this nature on a public server, so I just reported it to Zoom and speculated. So I kept looking, and this same message type also had something called the Dynapara table. And it was kind of like a JSON object at the end of each object. It was a table where you could have a name, like, I don't know, username, which was like the name of the object field, and then an object of any type. And the property values were variants that were defined like this. So they would have a type, and then they would have a length, and then they would have data. And what was super interesting was that this data was in a union with all these different types. So you see this, and you think type confusion. Could they possibly check that every single one of these is the right type before they use it? The short answer was yes. So I identified the functions mostly from the vtables and figured out how these things were accessed. And it seemed that the type checks were pretty stringent. There were a few bugs I found where they would confuse a pointer for a buffer. So, they would want to read a number, but instead they would read the pointer. But unfortunately, I couldn't find any situation where this was actually used in a bad way. Because ideally, I wanted an info leak. There were bugs where it would put a pointer in the log, but, if you can't access the logs, that doesn't really help you. So I kept looking, and I eventually found this bug, which was a lot of these properties were string type, and they would check that it was indeed a car buffer, but they wouldn't always check that it was null terminated. So there were quite a few bugs where it would convert to a string, and if there was no null terminator, it would read outside the string. And there were quite a few of these, but there was only one I found where you could actually get that data back, and that was the username. So in this situation, if I logged into a Zoom call and I provided a username in this object with no null terminator, and then I logged in from another computer, the username would be displayed to me with this extra memory from outside of the buffer. So this was cool. This was a way to read memory off this server. I tried it on my own server, and it worked. And this one, because it didn't cause crashing, I was willing to try on a public server. I found a proof of concept that basically always returned a pointer, and I tried it once on a public server, and I did get back a pointer. So this one I know works on Zoom's public server, and considering it's in the exact same interface as that overflow bug, this makes me very, very confident that that overflow bug would have worked on a Zoom server as well. So this impact is fairly concerning. This bug could have been used on a device too. So without the webinar, if you sent this bad packet, it would go to the device and it would crash the device. So that could allow you to see what's on a user's device. But on the server, that handles audio and video for a lot of people. So that would also be a way to either monitor Zoom calls, or an attacker could use this to compromise devices, and without the limitation of the Zoom contact, they could probably intercept the calls of any device and, for example, add a vulnerability to it. So I tried to exploit the server with both bugs. I ended up kind of giving up on this after, I would say, about looking at it for about 3 weeks. I do think it's possible, but it was just very time-consuming. So the overflow bug, I could use it to move the instruction pointer fairly easily by overwriting vtables. But my big problem was a lack of good heap manipulation. A lot of exploits, for example, in the browser will use JavaScript to allocate things on the heap or to release them, and you can really line things up and then get a specific slot and put stuff in it. And this was hard to do on this server. I found a few things, there were very few things that could actually permanently allocate something on the heap. And the ones I found had limitations. For example, every time you added someone to the call, it would allocate something on the heap. But then when I tried to automate it, either the person had to be signed up, so I would need like 1,000 accounts, or if I did it through the web browser, I would get a CAPTCHA after I did it about twice. So the anti-abuse mechanisms actually prevented me from putting everything I wanted on the heap, which was too bad. So I ended up, there were two things that were missing here. One was I wanted a controllable buffer that I knew the address of. I couldn't get this one to quite work. And I think this might not actually be necessary. I think with enough work, I probably could have found something in this non-relocatable binary that I could hook into and do ROP, but I didn't find anything like that. But it was also the heap manipulation to make it reliable wasn't really there either. Yeah. And one big problem was also there were separate heap arenas. So this server did a lot in different threads. So, for a while, when I was about to give up, I went around Project Zero and being like, hey, you give me an idea, you give me an idea. And almost all of these structures ended up allocated on different heaps than the overflow. The other big problem is the MMR server has an exponential backup, or backoff. So if this exploit had to actually be very reliable because it would start off, it would restart after a minute, then 2 minutes, then 4 minutes, and you would get up to an hour or a day really fast. So I think to exploit this server, you might have 10 to 20 tries tops before it became prohibitive to keep using your exploit. So I think that's about it. The important part is I reported all these bugs, and Zoom fixed them in November of 2021. They also enabled ASLR in this MMR server, so it will both be easier to fuzz, but also not as vulnerable to exploits, because now it's harder to find locations in the binary. And also, Zoom has improved auto updates, so all of the on-prem servers should have been updated to this new version as well. So, what did I learn here? So Zoom was a challenging target, and I would say mostly due to the sheer quantity of code. There was just so much stuff in there that I don't think was used, or I couldn't figure out how it was used, and that made it difficult. I think if I could go back in time and do this again, the one thing I would do differently would to be focus on entry points. There were a lot of times when I was like, oh, that bit of code looks cool, and that bit of code looks cool, and I wasted a lot of time with that when I found out, it wasn't hit, or it was hit only by server stuff I couldn't control, or that sort of thing. So I wish I'd just, done that dump over SSL and only looked at stuff that code could manipulate. Locating symbols, even old ones, made this effort much easier. So I would say I've been surprised about these messaging clients, but I would say I'm having a more than 50% success rate with finding symbols for them. So I think it's a good idea to check out the Wayback Machine and all the available binaries for everything you reverse engineer, because you never know what you're going to find, and sometimes it's great. And of course, everyone knows about IDA, but Frida and DR Sandcov were really great tools, and they made this project much better and easier. So you should definitely try them. So that's it. Thanks a lot, and I think I've got some time for questions here. So questions in the front?
Yeah. Do you set a time limit for yourself before you gave up, or what was your impetus to stop?
So I tried to. I think it's, I try to limit time I spend on exploitation just because my goal is to make bugs not available to attackers. So I feel like often, I could find 10 bugs in the amount of time that I spend exploiting stuff. But usually what I'll try to do for something like this is, at the beginning, come up with a goal that I think is reasonable, and then limit myself at that. And then at the end, I'm always like, one more week, and then that never works, and then I stop. Any more questions? Over there.
Check. In your explorations of XMPP, did you encounter any specific XMPP extension support, or did you delve into extensions much?
I looked at extensions a bit. I couldn't, there were very limited standardized extensions. So like I looked through the standard and was like, does this work? And none of them did. And then there are tons of custom extensions. But yeah, I would describe it as almost wild. There was like, yeah, tons and tons of custom stuff, but yeah, none of the cool stuff in the standard. Any more questions? Over there?
Which fuzzing platform did you use? Is it a custom one or a public one? Again?
Yeah.
So which fuzzing platform did you use?
Okay, I'm just going to report or repeat this. What fuzzing platform did I use? And yeah, I used one that's internal to Google that allows multi-core fuzzing. Over there?
Hi, Natalie. Great talk. I had a microphone keeps in and out. All right. I had a quick question about the last piece where you mentioned you were not able to find a controllable buffer that you know the address of. Since the MMR server binary didn't have ASLR, Was there any reason the controllable buffer couldn't be in the data segment of the binary you knew the address of?
Yeah, it could have been. I couldn't find anything controllable in there was the short answer.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Hey, great talk. I just wanted to ask you, so is there a platform you're interested in looking in next after Zoom? Maybe like, I don't know, Discord, Teams, or are you going to look at something different next?
So there's nothing immediate, but once again, if people have ideas, definitely, tell me about them. But a lot of the video conferencing platforms out there use WebRTC, and I did a blog post on that about a year ago where I found one WebRTC bug and showed that it worked on a lot of different messengers. So I think other than WebRTC, which is a video conferencing library, there's only, I think Zoom is the only, or I think the fourth custom implementation of video conferencing I've seen. So definitely things like Discord use WebRTC, but if you've found a fifth one, please let me know. I would love to look at it. Last chance for questions. Okay, that's great. Thanks so much.